Just waiting on Bobby's thumbs up. Thumbs up. Yeah. Well, this is our last week of our class. This is week 4. If you have not been in class the last 3 weeks, they are all on YouTube. I've verified that they're all there. If you can't find them, let me know. I will help you find them. But they're all there. So if this is interesting to you, if this is your first week here and you want to go back and watch some of those are all there. So this is a class called Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Tradition. And we've kind of talked about all kinds of things about hospitality, what we feel like that is, what our experiences of that are, and then what does that mean as a Christian practice, and as something that really is an ancient practice that Christians have practiced through generations. We've been working with this definition of hospitality: the quality or disposition of receiving and treating guests and strangers in a warm, friendly, generous way. There's lots of other things we could say about hospitality, and we have. But I would love to start out, because we've done 3 weeks of this class. What is something that has resonated with you from this class, from any of the weeks? Kind of putting you guys on the spot, but also I wasn't here last week, so would love to hear some of the things that resonated with you from any of the time that you've been here through this class. It's a cold question. Yeah.
I'm trying not to be the first person, but the thing that resonates to me is that a lot of, based on what you're sharing, hospitality, it comes from our own sense of empathy.
Yeah.
And so if we hurt, then we understand what another person is going through,
Yeah.
and we try to support them and show them comfort in their situations. Thus, we're hospitable to them in those moments.
Yeah, part of hospitality comes from us being able to see ourselves in the other person. And we talked about that with the Good Samaritan, being able to, the Samaritan probably had been in a situation similar to this man that he came across. And so that gives us fuels that empathy and fuels the actions of hospitality that we're able to show. Yeah. What else? Other thoughts? Anything that's resonated with you?
And back to the story of the Good Samaritan, one thing that maybe it was someone pointed out that I had never thought about before was the innkeeper's response. In his showing of hospitality, when he was brought someone that he was not expecting. So
right.
For me, it kind of reminded me, we may not always be the ones initiating the service,
right,
but we have to also be willing to accept whatever God puts in our hands.
Yeah.
To carry forward.
Yeah, whatever our role is in the story. Yeah, and I remember someone pointing out, I don't think it was me, but there was a lot of trust that he had to have. The Samaritan said, well, whatever other expenses you have, I'm going to come back and pay those. And so the innkeeper had to have some element of trust that may not happen, and I'm still willing to care for this person. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I don't speak too much English, but let me try the Spanish.
Go for it.
Some he helped me, okay? Maybe I speak in Spanish, he helped me with each other, okay?
Sure.
¿Me ayudas? ¿Ya? Okay, la hospitalidad, yo la entiendo.
Hospitality, I understand.
Cuando vine por primera vez a Bamel.
When I came the first time in Denver.
Hace más o menos 14 años.
It has been for like 14 years.
Jamás, nunca
I never
había sentido el amor de Dios.
I had never felt the God's love.
Cuando vine a Bamel, experimenté ese amor.
When I came to Bethel, I experienced the love.
Esta iglesia me recibió con los brazos abiertos.
This church has given me open arms.
Cuando desde niño
Since childhood,
crecí en las calles
I grew up in the streets.
y no sentíamos amor, no teníamos un abrazo.
We didn't have hugs, we didn't have love.
Y Bamel me acogió como el nido que nunca tuve.
Bethel gave me the nest that no one gave me.
Y esa es como yo he sentido la hospitalidad.
And that's how I felt my hospitality.
Y somos miembros del equipo de español.
And we're a team of Spanish people.
Y me ha enseñado, me ha moldeado mi vida
Samuel has taught me a lot of things
de una forma que impactó tanto que no quiero conocer otra vida.
in a way that nothing else has impacted me.
Y creo que Dios trabaja de esa forma.
And I think God like, works that way.
Y gracias a todos.
And thank you to everyone.
Gracias. Well, that's class today. Thank you for coming. Gracias. Thank you for sharing. Okay, I'm going to collect myself, and then we'll move on. I want to review a little bit from week 1. So if you haven't been here, I want to review a little bit from each week of some of the things that we've talked about. We started out talking about how there is this thread of hospitality that runs through the entire Bible, from the beginning, even set up at creation, where God kind of positions himself as a host and has prepared this place for us where we're the guests here. And then even I was thinking, so the women's study is doing Revelation. And in chapter 3 of Revelation, we even see where Jesus says, I'm standing at the door knocking, and if you invite me in, I'll share a meal with you. So even that thread continues all the way through Revelation, which is so cool to see. We talked about God's people experience this dual identity of they're the chosen people of God, and they know what it's like not to belong. They've been strangers, they've been slaves, they've experienced all these things. And we feel that sometimes. We feel like we don't belong, but also we know we're God's people, and what do we do with the combination of those roles? God calls his people in the Old Testament to protect and provide for the foreigner. God has always been a God of hospitality. He's always called his people to hospitality in very deep ways. It's part of our identity as people of God. And then in week 2, we moved to kind of the Old Testament. We talked about Jesus, how Jesus has also these dual roles. Jesus models both host and guest for us, and we see those play out in Jesus's life. The word hospitality in Greek in the New Testament is philoxenia, which means love the stranger, literally means love the stranger. So there's this emphasis not just on all the people you come in contact with or all the people in need, but specifically the stranger, the foreigner, the person who doesn't belong. By its nature, Christian hospitality is subversive and countercultural. It goes against some of the things that culture tells us, that it's safest to be with the people that are like you. It's safest to be with the people who identify with your beliefs or your background. And Christian hospitality, by its nature, goes outside of that on purpose. And that's not always met well by the outside. And in hospitality, we are giving others the gift of recognition, saying, I see you as a fellow human being. I see you as someone created in the image of God, and you belong here. It's giving not just the things that someone needs, the tangible things, but the gift of community, which is why it is so important. And then Michael did a great job teaching last week. I got to watch about half of that, which is what's online. But he talked about Jesus calling Levi, who was a tax collector, into community and sharing a meal with him. He talked about table fellowship and the importance of that. Talked about the response of the religious leaders, which was not supportive, and Jesus encountering that. And then he talked about practical steps that you can take within the circle that you are in towards hospitality, active listening, how important that is. And he went through this living in 3D. He had kind of these steps for how do you move towards hospitality in those circles. Discovering stories, knowing things about people, what are the important things to that person, developing relationships and taking the time to do that, and then discerning what the next steps are within that. Okay, so that's kind of trying to catch you up a little bit. If any of that is super interesting to you, go back and watch those. It will go into more detail. Okay, so I want to dive into the scripture for today, which if you didn't pick up a sheet, there's a few here. There's probably some floating around. It is going to be on the screen because it's kind of a shorter one. But this is the story of Mary and Martha. This is from Luke 10. So I'm just going to read this. If you have a sheet and you want to take notes or you just want it's easier for you to read on your paper, it's there in front of you. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. Some of you have been there. You know what that feels like. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." What can we learn about hospitality from this story? What stands out to you as you read through this story of Mary and Martha in regard to hospitality?
What stands out to me is that it seems on the surface that what Martha is doing is what we might think of, if you think of hospitality in the term of hosting someone,
Yeah.
that is more visually what we think that is taking care of people, providing, space and, foods and drinks and whatever.
Yeah.
But it sounds like what he's saying is that, yes, that is, but there is also a hospitality about the active listening, the being engaged.
Yes.
That is also a kind of hospitality,
Mm-hmm.
and push comes to shove, that one means more in this moment.
Right. Would you rather someone, we grew up going to my grandparents' house for Christmas a lot of times. And my grandmother was the kind of person who she loved to have people there, but while we're sitting and eating the meal, she would sit down and immediately get up and say, "Oh, do you need more tea?" And then she'd eventually sit down. "Oh, no, I need to get you." And finally, you just wanted to go, "Sit down. Just sit down. We're here to see you. We want to spend time with you, but we're not able to do that because you're so worried if we have the things that we need." And I want to validate that comes from a really caring place. Like, if you are that person, don't feel attacked. Like that, I understand the intention of that really is from a caring place.
It also sounds like it's some of the things that we do worry about in those situations are not as really important. Because if someone's thirsty, they're going to get drink and things, even though we're told to do that at times. But doesn't need to be the most important thing.
Right.
Unless that's the real need.
Yeah, if you really make them feel comfortable, they'll get their own drink, right?
I like that perspective. Like, when my best friend comes over, we've known each other through decades. She knows I'm not going to serve her none. She's like, "If I'm thirsty, I'll get up and get a drink." Because there's such a level of comfort there.
Yes.
But it takes a while.
But
It does.
Yes.
That time, yeah.
It's an interesting balance.
Kevin.
I was reading the message, and pretty much the last part was one thing is only is essential, and marriage shows that it's the main force and won't be taken from her. And I kind of view it as just relax, keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah. I love that. What else? Other things that stand out to you? Who do you see showing hospitality in this story?
Well, both of them, but also in a way Jesus, by kind of leading the conversation, and he's sort of hosting the social aspect, the educational aspect, depending on how you would look at it. So all three of them, really.
Yeah, I see everyone in this story really showing hospitality in different ways. Martha, I think, is doing the best she can in the moment, and really what she's been trained to do, what culture has told her, this is how you host people. I don't think Jesus faults her for that. I think this is a teaching moment for her. Mary is showing hospitality by that active listening that Michael talked about last week, and the way that she is fully focused on what Jesus is sharing with her in that moment, to where everything else, all the things around her, have disappeared. And then Jesus is making space for someone who would not traditionally be invited to sit and listen to the rabbi. That was a man's role there. The women are there to get the house, do what Martha's doing, and what Mary is doing is reserved for men to sit and listen to the rabbi. But he is making space for her and saying, "No, I've made a space for you here. Come on. You can stay here. You can sit and listen." And I think that's so cool to see all of those people showing hospitality in different ways and making space for people. So we talked about the Good Samaritan a couple weeks ago. I will put someone on the spot. Who wants to volunteer? Who wants to paraphrase, just kind of summarize, what is the story of the Good Samaritan? Who would be a brave soul who would like to kind of tell that story from memory? Or we can do it together. What happens first? Someone gets beat up. That's a great start. We're a great start. He's left on the side of the road. He's not in good shape, right? Yeah. Then what happens?
The religious people walk past him.
Yes. How many people do we have?
Twice, 2 times.
We have 2 times.
It's 2 no and 1 yes.
Yes. So we've got 2 religious people walk by, and for whatever reasons, doesn't really tell us, they not only do they pass by, but they pass by on the other side, right? And then what happens?
Samaritan comes along.
Mhm.
Tends to this one.
Yeah. Samaritan comes along. He stops. He sees the man. Remember, that was part of our conversation. He sees him. He stops, takes care of him. And then, yeah, they travel to an inn. Right.
So that someone else can care for him.
Mm-hmm.
In a-
Yeah, he pulls in reinforcements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Important.
He says, I need a professional here. Yeah. So he makes sure the man is taken care of. And then he tells him, whatever extra expense you have, when I return. Well, he stays with him through the night. We talked about that too. He stays with him all night and takes care of him. So in scripture, but in these gospel books, you have different characters. You've got the character in the story, all the characters in the story. You have Jesus, the way Jesus is, either Jesus is telling the story, Jesus is interacting with people. You have the person writing the book, right? You have Luke, in this case, is writing the Gospel of Luke. And you have God, I assume, is in some way involved. There's different ideas of the level to which God is God telling Luke exactly what to say in exactly what order. Are there choices Luke is making? There's also an audience that Luke is writing to. So there's a context, a community that Luke lives in, and some choices that he's making about which stories am I going to tell and how am I going to tell them, and are there words I'm going to use that are going to communicate to the community that I live in, that I'm writing within. Okay? There's a lot of different players here. One of the things that Luke tends to do is to pair stories together of a male and a female character. Okay? So he's telling 2 stories this happens about 16 times in Luke. He will tell 2 stories together to communicate a point, but one has a male character, one has a female character, protagonist. This is one of those examples. So the Good Samaritan is told first, immediately followed by the story of Mary and Martha. I find this so fascinating because I have never read these stories together. I wonder, are there any new insights? I just skipped a bunch. Are there any new insights you have from considering both of those stories together?
Today I'm having the feeling that I didn't need to judge the Levite and the priest. The point of the story was, who was the Samaritan? Who was the neighbor? You know?
Who was the neighbor?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I hadn't felt that before until this morning.
Mm-hmm.
And then the story with Mary and Martha, it's very obvious that we can learn about hospitality.
Yeah.
We can grow in the practice of hospitality.
Yeah. Yeah, we can. I think Jesus does tell these stories with some hope that people can grow towards this. You might identify with any of these characters, but the end result could be this person here.
Yes, and like the Samaritan, I got a feeling that maybe his default was, oh, look.
Mhm.
He went towards.
Yeah.
And the other two examples in that story were on the other side of the
Right.
road.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Thanks.
I don't know, just it was like stretching the two stories together. It's interesting going back to like the Good Samaritan story. You're talking like the two people who passed, and I was thinking about the verse 41. You could almost apply what we read here to that story of like, worried, upset about many things, but few things are needed.
Yeah.
You need only one. Like we all get busy, we see things on that side of the road, keep going,
Right.
but Mary's chosen was better. Samaritan choice was better. Like there's a lot of things like you can almost take the last part of this story and apply it to,
Right.
and it describes the same story.
Yeah, I can almost imagine Jesus talking to the priest and the Levite and saying, "You're worried about all these things, but there's only one thing that's really important right now in front of you." Yeah, Kevin.
I was thinking also it's like a tie-in of how what it means to love a neighbor, whomever that neighbor that be. You're not necessarily next door,
Yeah.
but someone you come in coalition with. I think both stories kind of talk about that. I mean, the Good Samaritan was an outcast as in that society, and yet the Samaritan became a hero, and with Mary and Martha, Jesus is like, hey, you never know who may be coming. You may not be part of the club, maybe an outcast. We're called to be like that. Love God and love others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Tasha.
And we also talk about, like, I just keep on seeing with both of these stories the art of being present and how God is present with us and how he has to bring us back sometimes to the reality of what really is supposed to happen.
Yeah. So good, Tasha. Thanks. Yeah, other thoughts?
I've never thought of these stories before, but I think it's interesting that neither like the priest or Levite or Martha were doing bad things.
Yeah.
The men were doing what men traditionally did. They
Right.
worked, provided for their family, they were traveling to work. They were doing church work.
Right.
And Martha was doing what the traditional woman should do.
Yes.
And how often does even doing good things distract us from obvious needs that we're ignoring?
I would imagine if I was hearing either one of these stories for the first time, as that story's being told, and I hear, oh, the priest passes by on the other side, and I'm like, yeah, and that's the moral of the story. That's what you should do. Or I hear the story of Mary and Martha. Martha is doing all these preparations, and I'm like, yeah, she's doing a good job. That's what Jesus is about to say. And it's so interesting in both these stories. I think Jesus suddenly, there's a plot twist. Oh, actually, who you thought was the hero of the story, it needs to be something different. It needs to look different.
Well, and what's interesting, something about the way you phrase that, and then thinking about what Tasha said about being present, it makes me think about this idea that we get on autopilot.
Yeah.
With like, we know what we're supposed to do, and it becomes rote, and so we are doing the right thing, the good thing, the normal thing, the everyday thing, but that allows us to not be present enough to notice immediate needs, and that it is in our best interest for the spiritual discipline to step out of routine and take care of an immediate thing. And boy, when you look at it that way, it's a lot easier to not demonize, because I feel like putting them together really helps with that context, because it's so easy to make those first two people in the Good Samaritan look like the pompous bad guys. But depending on where you look at it from, it's also easy to see, oh, these were people who were on emotional and mental autopilot, and don't we all have days like that?
Yes. Okay. Donna, I saw yours earlier, and then
just to play devil's advocate, and I 100% believe that we're supposed to, that these are saying abandon protocol, presence is more important. But every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else.
That's right.
And it just takes a lot of faith to know that God's going to honor that.
Yes, there is no guarantee, especially in the Good Samaritan story, there is no guarantee that this is a good person you're helping, right? There's no guarantee they're going to say thank you. There's no you cannot expect any reciprocal action from this person. And that's really, really hard. That's really hard to take time out of what the good things in your life that you know are good, to take time to do that.
To say nothing of the risk that what if it's
Yes.
actually a trap or something else like that?
Right, right. Do you have one? Yeah.
We're talking about being president and road activity. You know, I was at church once and you know how after church, we kind of do the greeting thing as
Yeah.
we head to the parking lot, you know? And so, I don't know if I intentionally did an experiment for this purpose, but I would have a person come up to me and say, "How are you doing?" Right?
Yeah.
You know, and typically you say, you know, good, and then people kind of, well, that's good, and then people. So I decided to one day be honest, right? I wasn't doing good,
Yeah.
right? And so the brother says, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm doing bad." And he said, "Well, that's good."
Yeah, that's not active listening. That's the opposite of
Right. So, you know, we do the religious thing, but we can miss the point of being present and listening and seeing,
right.
you know, because we're caught up in a thing, you know.
Yeah, so much of this is about slowing down, that maybe we need to practice slowing down a little bit in our lives.
Well, also just looking out.
Yeah.
Rather than looking in.
Yeah.
I mean, I had more of a question. I may have answered my own question. That was just interesting because, you know, maybe I am like staying out, like, hold on, I was being a little too harsh on Mark. But like, I guess. Well, like,
He wasn't going to say that. He did kind of point at you, but he didn't say that.
Well, like, I guess it was interesting because, like, people, you know, we have plenty of stories in the New Testament of people opening their homes to Jesus and bringing them in and having meals. And so I was like reading it again. I was like, well, it wasn't bad what she did. I was wondering, I know he uses like the word distracted, but then I didn't know if the fact that, like, had she not gotten frustrated about Mary, like, would it be a different take?
Yeah, is maybe the problem is not that she's doing all these things, but it's the judgment towards someone else who's not working as hard as me, or someone who's not doing this in the same way as me. That there's multiple ways to create hospitality for people. Yeah.
It seems to me also that it's kind of Martha's kind of almost like the other son in the prodigal son story.
Yes.
Like that they're, it's more kind of like, you know, yeah, you're doing all the right stuff,
right.
But you know, maybe that's not all what you need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great, I love that. I love that connection between those stories. I think that's true. Yeah, Mary.
You mentioned slowing down when it comes to relating to each other and whatnot. And Rachel was saying David said he's feeling bad. The person said that's good. That reminds me that when we're talking to people, especially our brothers and sisters in Christ, and you engage in this conversation, they tell you things are awful, things are really bad. Slow down enough to pray for that person. Don't tell the person, I'm going to pray for you. You standing right there with this person. What is it with this future stuff? I'm going to slow down right there and pray for that person right then and there. They know you really are tuning into what they're saying, and you're empathizing with them enough to put that situation in God's heart.
Yeah.
Don't make it a future thing. I'm going to pray for you.
Well, there's a good chance you'll forget to do it later because you'll be so busy, right? Yeah. 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 What does that moment call for? It's a great question. Yeah, Michael.
I think for a Jewish audience that these stories from Luke's gospel is offensive to their sensibilities. Okay, so we know about the contentiousness with the Samaritan community, long-standing, goes back centuries, right? Yeah. And then you think about this biblical window of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. This is actually called discipleship. Yeah. So we talked last week about Levi being called, how radical that was. Jesus is in effect saying, I'm calling you as my disciple.
Yes.
This is not an egalitarian society. So that is a radical thing.
Yeah.
And you take it up a notch to think about Mary and Martha have this ministry along with Lazarus of hosting the disciples. So there's 12 of them. So they're giving respite. It's a warm house. It's home cooked meals. It is a break from that pace of ministry that they're engaging in. Yeah. And that's a good place that Martha's coming from. She wants to honor that. And Jesus said, no, I am calling your sister to discipleship.
Yeah.
To be a disciple.
Yeah.
And that's just mind blowing because Luke's gospel is to to a Gentile audience.
Right.
And Luke's probably a Gentile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both of these stories, you see this thread of radical inclusivity, of Jesus reaching out and pulling in the Samaritan, the last person that this audience would have thought would step in, is the hero of the story. And then Mary, who should not be here, Jesus intentionally reaches out and brings her in. And if that isn't a picture of hospitality and what we've been talking about, that's exactly what it is. These, I almost don't want to tell you my personal takeaways because I don't think they're as good as the ones that you all just said. Busyness, talked about busyness, inclusiveness, the heroes of the story are people on the margin. The importance of truly seeing people. Mary saw Jesus. Mary took time to really see Jesus. Jesus took time to really see Mary. The Samaritans saw the man. Decentering yourself. So much of that going on in these stories. And then this idea of what is the connection between receiving Jesus, which is what Mary is doing, and then receiving others. There's this necessary contemplation, slowing down and spending time with Jesus. At the same time, there's action required and making space for others. And that's not a one comes first and then the other. It's both simultaneously all the time at the same time, and how important both of those things are. I think it is so cool to read these stories together. I think there's just so many new insights that come out of that. Okay, a little bit of history. I know not everyone is history people, but I've found it really interesting over these classes to kind of go through some of the history pieces because I think that they're important. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the early church, and we said one of the defining characteristics of the early Christian church was its intentional practice of hospitality towards the weakest and the most vulnerable. And that was different from the Greek and Roman societies that they were living in, because that was all about, I'm showing hospitality to the people that I want to impress. I'm going to show hospitality. I'm going to invite these people in that I want to be in good standing with. And that was how culture worked, to the point that there was a quote that we named from Julian, who was not a Christian emperor, who noticed how intentional the Christians were at this. And he said, they are excelling so much at taking care of the poor and the sick that are not even their people, that we need to try to imitate them because we're losing followers to Christians. Okay, so then something happens though. A lot of things happen in the 4th century. Something happens. So what changes? What changes is Constantine, Emperor Constantine, he was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. This is the first time the church suddenly has power and the church suddenly has resources. Because before then it was kind of, they're doing their best, they're kind of a minority, and then suddenly this really powerful person with a lot of influence becomes a Christian. Okay, so that brings all of these resources into the church. Whether it was a legit conversion, that's debatable. That's been debated by a lot of people for a long time. But what Constantine did was said, the church wants to reach out to do this hospitality really well, care for the poor and the sick. I'm going to give them the resources to do that. And we had the creation of hospitals. Okay, this is where hospitals were first created, this idea of hospices and hostels. All of those you can kind of hear the root word of hospitality. And suddenly there were places where the poor and the sick and the disabled and the elderly were cared for. And that seems like a really good thing. And there are really good things that happened from that. Basil, who was the bishop of Caesarea around 370, he created these hospitals that are really well known in history for being deeply connected to this element of care present in Christian hospitality. The poor could come and find community. The sick could come and find community. And he did that really well. For all its well-intentions at the beginning, over time, that has some repercussions. When people have become separated from culture and from community and from being visible, and there's not this expectation on the individual to care for the people that we see around us in need. This is a quote from the book. She says, although the development of hospices and hospitals emerged from early Christian impulses toward hospitality, these institutions were unable to capture and express some of the most fundamental personal dimensions of hospitality. Poor people and strangers were frequently cared for at a distance and in large numbers. Personal hospitality was increasingly reserved for visiting dignitaries. So what happens suddenly is now we've outsourced the caring of those people, and then our homes then are reserved for, I'm going to entertain, or I'm going to, invite impressive people so I can impress them. What cultural factors can you think about today that work against us in showing hospitality to others? Because it's really easy to go through a class like this and just feel guilted into, well, we should look more like the early church. But there's a lot of reasons we don't. And it's not all because we're bad people or because we've gone off track or because there's a lot of cultural factors and systemic factors that work against us. What are some things that you can think about? Liability, that's great. Someone said. Language barriers. Yeah, that's a challenge. We live in a country where there's a lot of languages, and that can be tricky. Yeah. And liability. You said liability. Yeah, for sure. What else?
Sometimes you can inadvertently offend someone by offering assistance.
Yeah, being afraid of offending somebody. Yeah. Well, being afraid of rejection. That's a hard one too. Yeah. Political views make that challenging. Yeah.
Well, as technology has allowed us to do a lot of things individually, we've become less communal, and
Yes.
you got to get out of practice.
Yeah, we become less communal as a result of technology. It is so individualized. We also see so much more suffering on our screen. You can become desensitized, and those aren't people you have a relationship with. And so it becomes a challenge, to make that applicable in your life today with the people you actually do see and know, right?
Another thing is that, especially in the United States, we have this ethos of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes.
Individuality and all that is obviously serves a lot of good, but it also, you're less, I think, sometimes inclined to help people.
Yes.
Just because you have that baggage of, I made it like it.
Yeah, if your first response, you've been conditioned to be judgmental. That, well, what, they shouldn't be in that. I'm not in that position. I managed to do it. How come they couldn't do it? Yeah.
Well, also when you mention technology, I'm sorry, everyone else raised their hands and polite. I'm so sorry. I'm out of practice.
It's okay. You're new here.
But you talk about technology, it makes me think about, to the point somebody else made, this idea that we are more connected than we've ever been, and also less connected than we've ever been. Because I can get updates from 50 people that I've known in my life, but am I having conversations with maybe one of those people, And so it makes me feel like I'm being informed and like I'm being communal, but I'm not really. I'm just reading someone else's experience.
Yes.
So it's much like the idea of outsourcing to something like a hospital, which is a wonderful intention, but it kind of allows you to go, okay, not it.
Right.
I don't
Right.
go to class reunions because I catch up with everybody else.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's one of the reasons why meals are still so important, because when you are face to face with somebody, you can't help but be connected with them in some way. And sharing a meal with someone is a really intimate thing. And I think there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. I don't even know all the reasons, but I think it really is. There's something about when you share a meal with somebody and you're across the table from them, you can't get that through a screen. Yeah.
One of the things when you said technology, I thought about my garage door opener.
Yeah.
I open it and I back my car out and I put the door down, and when I come home, put it up and I go in. We have big fences around our yards.
Yeah.
We kind of live an isolated lifestyle.
Yeah.
And, I know the neighbors whose yards touch mine, but,
So you can argue with them about who has to replace the fence. Oh, that's just me. Yeah.
There's just not that sense of, when I was a kid, we didn't doors down,
Yeah.
you know, and they
Yeah.
knew my name.
Yeah.
You know, stop.
Because they were yelling.
My flower, whatever, but
Yeah.
it's just, we've gotten more isolated
Yes.
in our lives.
We make sure we don't have to see anybody.
And it's a
If we don't want
security,
If we don't want
it's a
to.
security thing.
Right.
To some extent, you know, it is. We
Added
look at our,
attention.
we
Mhm.
look at our Ring doorbell to see who's at the front door.
Right,
you
right.
know.
Yeah, absolutely. And our homes are smaller than we have big homes, but we have our households are smaller than they've really ever been in history. And working, like most families, you've got two working parents now, or two working people. People aren't home. There would be people, at least somebody was home during the day. And that's less and less the case, where there's so many more families that nobody's there most of the time. So it's really hard to think, how do I open my home to somebody? That sounds nice, but the logistics of that are really challenging. Just something.
You know, it says cultural factors and
Mhm.
hospitality to others, and that other word is really the deal.
Yeah.
And so socially, you know, any of the social economic things that separate us,
Yeah.
these are the things that cause us not to show hospitality.
Mhm.
And if it's, you know, socioeconomics, if it's
Mhm.
race, if it's religion, if it's age, you know,
Mhm.
sex in some cases, whatever, gender rather, whatever it may be, you know, these are grounds for us to divide.
Yeah.
And we're talking about technology. You know, these algorithms are
Mhm.
designed to feed us what we want.
Yes.
Whatever our normal is,
Yes.
that's what we're reinforced.
That's right.
So the other conversation just gets reinforced
Right.
because, you know, it's us and them.
Yes.
And so we probably need to turn off social media so we can connect
At times,
as
yeah.
humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know we talk about like busyness a lot and slowing down and not having time, but I think the other cultural piece is like in our United States, we're so busy. We're so
Yes.
busy. And talk about how, like, you know, somebody talks about it, or like you have a bucket of like energy you can allocate out. And
Right.
even if you have time, the
Yeah.
byproduct is like you've allocated, expanded all your energy
Mm-hmm.
to other things. Sometimes just tired. And,
Yeah.
like, showing hospitality to others can
Right.
still be a drain of energy.
Absolutely.
It's not a negative thing, but everything takes your energy.
Absolutely.
So,
We don't have a lot of reserve right
yeah,
now.
you only have so much that
Yeah.
you just are exhausted.
Yeah, because busyness is equated with success.
Yeah.
You feel successful the busier you are, right? All right, Michael.
So it was about 6-7 years ago, my chiropractor at her clinic, one of her associates, her fellow chiropractor, his son died tragically. He was playing basketball and he had a massive heart attack. He was like 18 years old.
Gosh.
So I walked into the clinic and I saw him in the back room and I said, "Dr. McGurr, how you doing?" And he said, "Not well." So as opposed to what happened with Reggie, I went into that and I said, "Tell me more." And he told the story to me. And then I got treated. As I was leaving the clinic, Dr. Andrews, the clinic director, said, "I really want to serve this family, but I'm fearful of doing the same thing. Can you help me?" And I said, "Well, Dr. McGurr is Nigerian, and his culture bringing food to one's home, it's a sign of friendship. It's just a beautiful way to serve somebody."
Yeah.
And I said, "I'm willing to bet that his family would invite me in." So the next time I went to the clinic, she said, "I did exactly that. They invited me in and they told the story about how they were grieving. And the grieving was quite intense and very emotional."
Yeah.
So culturally, she was ready for that moment, and they felt seen and heard and loved by her.
Yeah,
So
and
that fear factor is real.
it's real. It's real. Crossing those cultural boundaries and you being so afraid you're going to say the wrong thing, which again comes from a good place. I don't want to offend somebody, but the byproduct is it makes me unlikely to reach out and risk making a mistake, right? We only have a few minutes left, and I really want to get to my end point. Okay, so as an antidote to, we could kind of go through this whole class and we could just feel stuck where we kind of are right now, where we've got all these cultural factors working against us, and that is real. And we could also be really convinced that hospitality matters, but it's really hard to know what to do in between those things. So here is one of the suggestions that came from this book. So in the Old Testament, when we see these examples and these stories about hospitality, the way that an Old Testament city was set up is that you had the city, you had the homes, and then you had the city gate. And the city gate was a public space. It served several different purposes. It was obviously the entry and the exit point. It was a security point where they could make sure that the city was secure. It served as the courthouse. It was like legal proceedings happened there. In the story of Ruth and Boaz, this is where they kind of congregate to sort out, well, who can Ruth marry now? That happens at the city gate. But it also was a community gathering place. And so this is where strangers, foreigners would come to the city. They would come to the city gate. And at the city gate, they had the opportunity to spend time with people from the city. You didn't go from, oh, this person just walked up to our city, I'm going to invite them to stay in my home. Most of the time, there was this kind of middle area, this very public space. So the suggestion is, how can we make hospitality more public in order to give us some steps towards making it more personal? In large communities of hospitality, there are kind of these bigger communities that are intentionally set up for this, and she interviewed a whole lot of them for this book. They create a lot of shared spaces. There's a lot of shared activity between people. There's a lot less risk when things are more public. You've got a lot of people around. It's why on a first date, you don't go to someone's house. You shouldn't. You should meet at a coffee shop, right? Like we know this for some things, but these are some steps we can take towards making hospitality more accessible in our lives. Here is her quote. She says, "Hospitality begins at the gate, in the doorway, on the bridges between public and private space. Finding and creating threshold places is important for contemporary expressions of hospitality. Without intentionally building some minimal connections, it is unlikely that we will welcome the most vulnerable people into our homes or churches, even if we accept responsibility to offer hospitality to strangers and recognize its significance for them. Even though we are in this class and we say, yes, I believe this is important, I can see it through Scripture, I know this is what God wants us to do, if we're not intentional about creating those kinds of places and those practices, we're probably not going to move any further towards that. And that's something that's been convicting for me in my own life. This whole class has been convicting for me. And trying to wrestle with, well, what does that look like now? What does that look like going forward? There's this concept now of third places. People will talk about third places, something that's not your home and it's not your work. It's a third place. So it can't be your church. It could be the gym. It could be the library. It could be a bookstore. It can be a coffee shop, somewhere else that you go and you spend time around people. And a lot of times that creates those entry points, like the city gate would, into welcoming people into your life. Okay, so three things. Cultivating Christian hospitality today. Place, we just talked about this. Find and create those threshold spaces in your life. Those are going to be different for you than it is for me, except that we all have church. So this is a helpful first step. We all have BAML. BAML does this really well, I think, too. And being an intentionally diverse and welcoming church, we have the opportunity to meet people here where we can develop those relationships. So second is people. Sometimes there are threshold people. So we see this at Manna a lot, where people who have been guests at Manna start to volunteer or start to become a person who can be even more empathetic because they've been there. But they also are really good at recognizing risk because they've been there. And so sometimes it's helpful to find some of those kinds of people, especially in a situation where there are socioeconomic differences, or this is a very different, kind of like Michael served as the go-between with this person. Well, let me help you understand this person's culture, and this is probably what's going to happen, and set those expectations. That's the kind of person that sometimes is really helpful to have. And then it just takes time. You have to spend the time and take the time to cultivate those relationships, to know if you want to bring that into a more personal space, or maybe your job is done in that third space, right? Okay, we're going to skip that question. last quote I will leave you with. She says, hospitality is resistance, especially when the larger society disregards or dishonors certain persons. Small acts of respect and welcome are potent far beyond themselves. They point to a different system of values and an alternate model of relationships. And I think that's what we're called to as Christians. Okay. If you are interested in reading more, this is the book that we've been using. We only got through half of it, actually. So there's a whole other half of this book. The book and the study guide are available all kinds of different places. I was planning to use a variety of different books, and I liked this one so much that I kind of just stuck with her material. It does have a lot of the history in it and everything. She actually died in 2023, I believe, and she's written several books, but I highly recommend this book if you're interested in learning more. And then next week, I'm going to be teaching another class right after this one, but it is not on hospitality. We're going to do something really cool I wanted to tell you about because the first sermon in this series is today. And so our class is going to follow the sermon by 1 week. So next week, we're going to be discussing what David talks about in his sermon today. So I thought we're going to kind of do that through this series. It's about 4 weeks long. And I thought that would be kind of a neat thing to try because I don't think we've really done that before. This is Sketches of the Kingdom. He's doing a sermon series on the parables of Jesus. So I think that'll be fun for us to just see how that works, and we can discuss what the parable and the story that he talks about that week, the next Sunday, give you a little bit of time to think about it. Okay, and that's class. Thanks for being here.
My son is